everyone, Dan Keeler here, founder of Frontier Markets News, bringing you more fascinating insights about the stories unfolding in what I like to think are the world's most interesting countries. In this episode, I'll be talking with Tarik Senhaji, who is the CEO of the Casablanca Stock Exchange in Morocco. Among other things, we'll be discussing Morocco's role in West Africa and beyond. We'll hear about how the stock exchange is encouraging more closely held firms to list, about the growing role of Moroccan banks across Africa, and the impact of generational change in Morocco itself. But enough from me. Let's hear from Tarik. Tarik, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
So one of the things about Morocco, I covered it a few years ago and had a number of meetings with people where there was a clear focus on Morocco's potential role as a gateway for investors to Africa. And that seemed to make a lot of sense at the time because Morocco obviously had relatively developed regulatory system and structures, and it seemed like it was getting quite a lot of traction. Can you kind of fill me in a little bit on whether that's still a priority to be seen as a gateway for Africa?
No, definitely. I mean, Morocco has a very interesting geographical location, and that's something that has proven to be a boon for us and for our economy. It's not only about geography, it's also about history. Morocco was the only North African country which was not invaded by the Ottomans. And so Morocco, as a historic state, has always developed as a north to south or south to north trade venue rather than a Mediterranean venue like most of the other countries around the Mediterranean. And so that has meant that we have very long historical relationship. Obviously, everybody knows the relationship with Spain and Portugal, but also very strong relationship with West Africa, with Senegal, with Ivory Coast, and with that whole region. And I find it a little bit funny because you have all these old trading routes, you know, the Chinese with this one belt, one road. It's kind of historical routes that's been disrupted by, let's say, a period of history which was a little bit violent and colonial. And it seems to me it's like nature is taking back its course. So for Morocco, it just felt natural to. And I think that's something that, we had to sit down and thought that it made a lot of sense to kind of develop a much more diverse relationship, especially that Morocco has that ability and that very special in place, and also a certain culture for trade that has stayed. So, for example, we are the only African country which has a free trade agreement with the US. We have a very strong relationship with most of the European countries. And also, as I said, we have developed very strong economic relationship. The cultural relationship with Africa was there. But now we've made a conscious effort, especially there were some very good deals to be had after the 2008 crisis. So Moroccan banks have gone in a big way into Africa. Today, Moroccan banks are present into more than 35 countries in Africa, which is a big number. Morocco is the second largest African investors on the continent behind South Africa. Morocco is the first African investor in West Africa. So that economic play makes a lot of sense for us, and we believe a lot in the potential of the African continent. And as the African continent will grow, we believe the Moroccan economy will grow as well. But that's not the only play that we have there. We believe as well in intra-African trade. Today, there is a shocking number, which is just 12% of African trade is intra-continent. That means that an African country on average imports 88% of its goods from outside of Africa. When you know the cost of the logistics, when you know the difficulty, and as you know, the maps that are depicting Africa depicts it much smaller than what it is. It's a big country, a big continent. And so we are a very strong believer as well in South-South partnership. We are a very strong believer in the fact that economic relationship between economic operators African economic operators will grow in a strong way. I think this is something that we have seen on the world stage in banking. The banking sector is now subject to such a strong scrutiny in terms of due diligence, in terms of compliance, that a number of foreign banks are exiting Africa, and I think that's as well something that might happen in other things and other sectors. So yes, Morocco is been doing well there, and I think Morocco as well is positioning itself as a gateway towards Europe in many other things. And I'll just give a quick statistic. Maybe more than half the IPOs that we've had on the Casablanca Stock Exchange were partially to finance African expansion of Moroccan companies.
Yeah, I love that idea of the reviving kind of the old traditional trade routes, and it totally makes sense that you would have that sort of trade between Europe and particularly West Africa go through Morocco. And it's kind of interesting when you start to re-envision the world as a sort of post-colonial structure, and as you mentioned, really interesting to see the Silk Road becoming a significant trade route and the links that's recreating or, I guess, regenerating between the countries along that route. It's fascinating to think of the same thing happening with Africa. And as you say, so many economies that are really vibrant that just don't have enough access to the sort of trading capacity that they need. So one of the things that you brought to mind there when you were talking about the relationships between Morocco and other African countries was the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Is that something that Morocco is sort of actively participating in? And do you see that as a development that is going to really help develop that intra-African trade? It
is the only way for Africa to get its act together, to be very frank, because as I said, when you look at the numbers and the logistical routes, it is the only way, and Morocco has been very strongly involved in that. But on top of that, you have to have the infrastructure. So some of the things just two examples on the port side. Many years ago, maybe 22 years ago, Morocco decided that it will launch a megaport in Tangier. And Tangier is the door of Africa. And I remember at that time, many consultants were like, oh, why are you doing so big? You start small, and then maybe in a few years, then you'll get bigger, etc. And I think it's part of the belief that we have that we started big. And that's something that paid off in a big way. Today, the Tangier Med port is among the top 20 in the world. It is only bested by two ports in Europe, the Bruges and obviously the Rotterdam one. The second one, which is again part of this vision that Morocco has, is the port of Dakhla in the south of Morocco, where we have this clear vision now that it should be something that serves West Africa, and we can have a kind of a Sahel route, again coming back to this ancestral roots, which makes so much more sense. I mean, if I look at the Tangier port, as I said in the beginning, it was like a dream. Today, it's the backbone for our auto industry. I've prepared some numbers while I was preparing this podcast, and I was surprised because, day to day, you don't see necessarily the big change that is happening. But if I look at our exports in 2010, we had 113 billion dirhams of exports, and 1/3 was phosphates. As you know, it's the main mining resource in Morocco. Today, those exports have quadrupled. So we are today at 430 billion. And out of that, 1/3 is the auto industry. So Morocco, which used to be, not an industrial powerhouse, today has the ambition by 2025, 2026 to export 1 million autos, which is a pretty big number. And it shows, I think, the story of Morocco. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to talk about Morocco, because sometimes it's difficult to have a news report about a country where things are going pretty well every year and not much drama is going on. And that's what's happening with Morocco. We'll get to talk about the extraordinary stability of Morocco, but that has allowed us to build something which is coming stronger and stronger, and also more and more credible. And now that we've done it in the industry, you might have heard that there are some very ambitious plans on the energy as well, for having Morocco as a renewable energy generator for Europe. There is the project of X-Links, where the UK would be furnished by renewable energy from Morocco, and that's something that's gaining ground. So there is, when you are patient and you have a plan for the long term, then things start happening.
That is a really interesting point, that you don't get that much attention when things are going well. And this is something that, one of the things I love about my job is that I'm actually checking in on countries where things are going quite well. And, Morocco is one of those that just feels like it flies under the radar, and yet there's so much interesting stuff going on there. I feel like we could probably do a whole separate podcast about the renewable energy aspect of things, and maybe I should. But just thinking about what the Moroccan authorities are doing to grow the economy and to sort of broaden it. Can you tell me about any of the other initiatives that are taking place at the moment, particularly from a sort of top-down level, to try and broaden the economy?
Sure. So I'll say just a couple of sentences because it's important about the social model of Morocco. Again, things are going well. We have been able to build a society which was an open society and also very inclusive society. I am very proud that we live in a very open country, and the state is taking the proper initiatives in order to make that continue. And I think the number of tourists that come to Morocco can attest to that. And so that's as well, it's important to take the time to say that's the backbone as well of our economic model. On the economic side, Morocco has always believed in the importance of investment. So our investment rate of 31% is one of the highest among emerging markets. And that's good. I mean, if you visit Morocco every decade, you can see the level of infrastructure. And I've talked about the port, but it's not only that. It's the airport, it's the highways, it's a lot of things which are done properly. I think that the difference today is that the state has realized that we got into an equilibrium point where we need more private sector initiative and private sector investment. And that for two reasons. First, because they've understood that it gets you more leverage. And the second thing as well is they understood that the governance of a private sector investment or a privately funded investment is different from the governance of a public sector one. And we need some of that IRR generation, performance looking, and governance. So they've come up with very clear targets, which was announced by His Majesty himself, which is up to now 2/3 of the investment in Morocco has been coming from the public sector, and that within the next 13 years we would like that dynamic to change, and that 2/3 of the investment would come from the private investment, not only private sector, but private investment in general, and that includes obviously institutional investor, but also includes international investors. And for that, they've made quite a few changes. One of the changes is the investment charter, which is they've kind of upgraded it to be much more encouraging for the private sector investment. But also they've come up with an innovative idea, which I think is already been tested, which is to come up with a sovereign wealth fund, but it's a sovereign development fund who would co-invest and encourage co-investment in the country.
And the idea of the sovereign wealth fund also prompting kind of co-investment, that's something I'm seeing gaining increasing traction in other countries, and it seems to be quite successful at drawing in international investment because you're providing that sort of security, the confidence that you get with investing alongside a sovereign wealth fund. What are key things that international investors should know about Morocco, though, if you're looking to bring more international investment in, both in through private equity and presumably through public equities as well? Are there any, say, for example, frontier market investors often confront liquidity issues, getting money particularly out of a country, not just in, but out of a country. Are there any key issues that international investors should know about, or anything that, any developments that are going to be making the process of investing through Morocco or into Morocco more interesting?
I think it's a very, very important. It's a very important point. It's probably the first point, especially that I know investors have not had always good surprises when it comes to that in some of the frontier markets. But one of the key elements of Morocco is its stability and also its commitment to international investors. So we never, by law, if you invest in Morocco, you can get your money out at any point in time you want. And not only that's by law, but that's been, proven by a long history. There hasn't been a single case of an investor wanting to pull out and not getting that approval. And that doesn't apply only to capital markets instruments. If you come to the real economy and you invest in Morocco, any day you want to get out, you can. So I think that's something that's very important.
Are you seeing new investors pay attention to Morocco? Are you seeing new groups and new maybe institutions that are starting to recognize the opportunities there?
Yes, I mean we do this roadshow which is called the Morocco Capital Market Days, and in general it goes to London once a year. And for the past 2 editions, we've had so many more investors than usual. That is matched as well by what we're seeing in the local market. The Casablanca Stock Exchange never has had issues of attractiveness. I think it always had an issue just that investors couldn't find enough companies, enough fresh paper to buy into, simply because we have a very developed pension fund industry, we have a very developed asset management industry. For example, our local asset management industry weighs something like $62 billion, which is, on the top of my head, 40% of our GDP. So the issue was always like, I don't have enough choice, there is not enough paper, there is not enough opportunities. That is starting to turn. Over the past couple of years, we are seeing interesting IPOs come to market. We are seeing dynamism come to market. So I have to say as well, it's also by elimination with regards to the rest of Africa, but Casablanca Stock Exchange has had 1/3 of IPOs of the African continent over the past 3 years. And we believe because of this push to try to get more private investment, more private sector, we believe that that's going to continue. I'll give you a very simple example of one of the star companies these days. It's called Agdital. It IPO'd about 18 months ago. So the IPO was successful, but also post-IPO price return was plus 150%. And essentially, it's a company which believed very early that healthcare, providing healthcare would turn in Morocco. It would not be publicly based anymore, but there will be opportunities for private healthcare, and they've done really well. I like to think as well that it's a sign that the Casablanca Stock Exchange is very open to new ideas and new sectors, because it was a sector which wasn't there, and so it was opened by this company, and they made the largest private fundraising since 2008. So I think that the appetite is there. There's always been the people like what they see in Morocco, but maybe we haven't had as many opportunities to accompany the private sector companies that we've had over the past couple of years. And I believe that trend is going to continue because of, as I said, the strategy that's been laid out.
What is actually driving the growth in IPOs, though? Is it just the sense that companies want more access to, or want access to more capital? And in parallel with that, are you doing anything at the stock exchange to help deepen that market, to create more opportunities for investors to put money to work?
So I think, as I said, we are seeing more interest simply because the economy is opening up a little bit more. As you know, we have a World Cup coming in 2030, and we have other things coming. And I think that the state has arrived at the conclusion that it would be beneficial to get a lot more private investment in. So I'll give you an example. The link with private equity between the private equity and Bourse de Casablanca was broken around 2011, 2012, and it kept broken for like maybe 7 years. Now for our last 4 IPOs, 3 were coming from private equity.
What do you think prompted that change in interest?
So I think the whole makeup of the financing is changing. I like to say that Morocco in general, we were too debt dependent, whether the fact that we have a very active bond market, the state has, treasury has quite interesting yield curves, and also we have a very developed banking sector. But I think today we are getting into the point where it's not a question of financing anymore. So that answers your question. It's a question as well of growth. So if you rely on debt, that means that you are only relying on incremental growth. If you rely on capital, that means that you're relying on exponential growth. And I think that's a change of mindset that's starting to appear.
What are the reasons for this change?
For many reasons. So one of the reasons I've talked about, but also the other big reason is the change in management. Morocco got its independence in 1956. So we had a generation from that independence, which took quite a long time. Now we are starting to see the second generation and the third generation who have studies abroad, who are coming up with new ideas and also are much more open about, as I said, going to Africa, going to Europe. And I think we're reaping the reward of that.
In what way are you reaping the rewards of that?
I joined the stock exchange in 2020, so 4 years ago. And I arrived at a conclusion which is counterintuitive, which is that our clients were valuing the stock exchange way too much. They felt to the point that they felt intimidated by it. So that's not something which you can necessarily think, well, it's a bad thing, but actually it's a bad thing. It's like when it's the anniversary of your wedding and you have to go into some very expensive shops that you are not used to, and you feel all like uncomfortable and sweaty. That's what the CEOs of those companies felt when they were in the presence of the Casablanca Stock Exchange. They felt like, yeah, it's nice, but it's not really for me. It's maybe for more sophisticated companies. It may be more for the banks, more for the state. So we've tried to be much more on the ground and much more talking to them through people that they find credible. So one thing, for example, a simple thing that we've done, we didn't have an association of companies which were listed on the stock exchange. So each company was big enough and smart enough. So we said, no, look, let's get together, create that association. It will help you lobby, obviously, and share, but also it will help us convince new companies. Look, there is this club. Why don't you come and just discuss with them? And you see that it's not so bad because I don't think it's only in Morocco. I think in any country, a company when it looks to a stock exchange, it has that fear of losing control. Like the company will be look at the language that you use, introduced to the stock exchange. So it's not with me anymore. It's going to be introduced into the stock market. Mm-hmm. And whenever I make this mistake, they will laugh at me and say, oh, look how stupid he is. And so we had to get out of that and say, look, come meet all these companies who IPO'd and now they have enough money to buy back their shares and leave if they want, but they're not because it's so much more useful for them. I've had really fantastic stories that now I am pushing to everyone where, it's 3 brothers who founded the company. And 30 years later, 40 years later, there is maybe 20 shareholders sitting and that company told me if we were not listed and we didn't have, very strict guidelines of management, the company would probably have been bankrupt because being on the stock exchange, it gives you credibility, but it's also, you are more institutional. I've had testimonies from companies who said, look, I am exporting, and when I got introduced to the stock exchange, when I go and try to get a new market and I tell them I'm listed, it adds so much more value. So these are the kind of things that we've tried to do as well to be able to be closer. And also we work so much more closely with the ecosystem. And when I say the ecosystem, before we used only to work with the investment bankers, but now we work with, I've talked about the private equity, but we work as well with the accountants, we work with the local chamber of commerce, etc., etc. And sometimes, sometimes less is more. That's what we've been trying, and knock on wood, it's been a good message that people have appreciated.
That's really interesting. The idea that you're kind of making it more appealing and you're making it less intimidating to list on a stock exchange. I feel like in many of the countries that I cover, where the stock exchanges are tiny and find it very hard to grow, I think that some of the lessons that you're learning through that could be very useful in other countries too. So maybe you can sort of put together a how-to guide for making stock exchanges slightly more appealing to company owners.
Well, hopefully in a few years, we'll do a use case, you and I, about the revival of a stock exchange. Let's knock on wood.
Yeah, we'll put that in the calendar for 2026. So one of the other questions, I mean, we mentioned, or we touched earlier on the idea of countries only really getting attention when there's when things aren't going well, and obviously many things are going well in Morocco. One of the things that I'm kind of concerned about, looking more broadly across the region, particularly into West Africa, and then looking across the MENA region, which obviously many people consider Morocco to be part of the Middle East, which just constantly baffles me, but it's still like lumped in with the Middle East. Given what's been going on in the Middle East, particularly with the kind of escalation of the situation between Israel and Palestinians, and given what's been going on in West Africa with the Sahel and with Russia's involvement and with the various coups that have been happening, how is this going to have or is this having an impact on Morocco? Is this having an impact on your sort of strategy? These two sort of pretty substantial geopolitical crises effectively happening at the same time.
So the first one, yes, we are going to be impacted, but I don't think we are going to be impacted any more than other countries in West Africa. So now we come back to the question of the Sahel security and what's going on there. I hope, and I think it's going to probably strengthen Morocco's position. I think something that I was surprised on, I'll be very frank, but something that I was surprised on is when I traveled into West Africa and their respect for Morocco and for the Moroccan king. Something that we weren't necessarily taught at school, but Islam came from Morocco for many of these countries. And Morocco has a history of being a Sharifian state. So His Majesty is a descendant of the Prophet, and I think Morocco has this blend of religion and as well as freedom that is sometimes very hard to understand for someone, because most of the other country he compares with, that blend is catastrophic, while in Morocco that's a fantastic blend that is allowing us to be, I think as a society, much more stable, much freer in what we do, much freer in how we express ourselves, how we travel around the world, how we have many compatriots around the world who come back. And so I think Morocco's role within the Sahel and within West Africa is probably going to increase over the next few years. And I think that is going to be a great factor of stability for the region.
Super interesting to think of the role that Morocco is playing in West Africa, particularly, but in the relationship between Europe and Africa, and super exciting to think of the effort that the leaders of that country are putting in to try and make sure that it's a stabilizing and positive force.
Morocco is gaining a lot from the fact that it's a stable monarchy, and that means that the policymakers have long-term vested interest in the decisions they make. That has been a big advantage for us. It's like someone who trades the market on a daily basis and someone who trades the market over 10 years. Morocco has had always long-term strategies and long-term views, and also the ability to be a credible partner And that's something that's, on a day-to-day, maybe you don't see it, but when you take a little step back, you can see that, it makes a lot of sense. For example, the decision, for example, from Moroccan banks to buy out the French banks after the 2008 crisis, that was a very smart trade. And I mean, anyone who had a little bit of a longer time frame would understand that it would be fantastic value. These are the kind of things that, we are reaping the rewards of, and we hope that we will continue to find credible partners around us to continue to build value for everyone.
And that ties back to my original comment, really, which is that years and years ago, I was already talking to people about some of the things we've been talking about today. And that's obviously showing that there is a long-term strategy at play here. And it's great to hear how that's playing out, and that more people are beginning to appreciate the importance and the power of the role that Morocco can play in the region and beyond. Well, so Tarik, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really interesting talking to you. I love the fact that we've veered from just purely economic discussion into something a little more philosophical. And I, wish you the best of luck with everything that you're working on at the moment. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Dan. It was a pleasure. And as I said, an opportunity for me to talk about our market. So thanks for that.
Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion with Tarik Senhaji, the CEO of the Casablanca Stock Exchange in Morocco. Thank you for listening to the Frontier Markets News podcast. As always, you can get the latest summary of news from the frontier and growth markets at frontiermarkets.co, and that is .co, not .com. You can also sign up there for our weekly newsletter, which will land in your inbox every Sunday and provide you with a digest of the week's key news from smaller emerging markets. The music on this podcast is What's the Angle by Shane Ivers from silvermansound.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast and you want us to be able to produce more of them, please share it with your friends, your colleagues, your neighbours, your family, your followers on social media. Really, anyone you can think of. And make sure you subscribe to this pod wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Send me an email at dan@frontiermarkets.co. And that's a wrap. Until next time.